Hello, my name is Melissa Shepard, and I'm President and CEO of Blizzard Tech Consulting. And I'm going to talk to you today about how to tackle your everyday business problems like an architect. So Salesforce architecture, that's a big buzzword in the ecosystem these days. Everyone's an architect of something, or there's architect certifications. There's a whole architect pyramid that everyone seems to be aware of. There's the application architect and the system architect, and they the two certifications lead you to the top of the pyramid, which is the technical architect, the CTA, and it's something that a lot of people are aspiring to be, and a lot of people are preparing for it, and but I see a lot of times in the ecosystem that there's not a lot of clarity on what exactly an architect is. So that is the idea of this presentation. I want to talk to you a bit about what an architect does, what it's all about, kind of clarify what you might have in your head as a definition of an architect, just to make it a little bit more clear, and also help you to learn about some skills that you can bring into your everyday job, so that you can, bring architecture into your day-to-day job. And like I said, tackle your business problems like an architect. So I have some things that I can share with you that will help you do that. So many people might ask, what is architecture all about? What is an architect? What does an architect do? Is this something that I can do? So these are the things I'm going to try to answer throughout the presentation, and help you understand more about architecture. So why is architecture important? This is probably the first thing we need to address. And this is important because it provides the building blocks of really any Salesforce implementation. Without architecture, your project is likely to not go well, or not be scalable, or not be usable for the long term. And it might not actually meet the business problem. So there's a lot of different pieces to architecture, and it's just the foundation. It provides the most scalability, the most performance, a design that really is sound that you can then build upon. And you take into consideration things like system limitations and governance and regulations. And it is important for project success, and it's also helpful to reduce future costs and increase ROI. Some of the things you see here, things like large data volumes, and some companies are very large and have a large number of transactions, so you've got to take into consideration, am I going to hit the limits, API limits, things like that. And there's also complex transactions. Sometimes you have to think about the order of your operations, or if you're integrating with other systems, you're sending maybe a header record, and then you have to come back and get the child record. So there's all these different things that play a part in architecture, and also org complexity is a huge part of it as well. So how can you start thinking more like an architect? Well, first, you really have to understand what architecture is, what an architect does, and then you can start to identify the things that you can do in your day-to-day job that maybe are more on the architect side. And this goes for developers, it goes for admins. There's a lot of admin work involved in architecture. So it's not just developers, it's both sides. You've got to be able to bring them both together and understand when you're going to use custom code in Apex, or when are you going to use a flow, and when would you use a workflow or a process builder. You've got to understand when you want to use one over the other. It's not just straight across the board, all declarative, all programmatic. It's a combination. So the next thing would be practice. So once you identify the things that you can do, you want to practice those things, and you want to bring those into your everyday job, and just keep working at those things, and keep identifying more areas where you can bring architecture into your day-to-day job. And then a huge recommendation would be to review the things that you have identified and that you're working on with someone more senior, or maybe another architect or a CTA. That's the best way to really grow and understand and learn, is to work with somebody that has a good understanding and that can help guide you and lead you. So kind of like a mentor, on the job mentor, just anyone that's a little bit more senior that has more experience in architecture and the different areas involved. So one of the things an architect does is they think big picture. So will this scale beyond the current problem I am solving? So you might be requested to do something like create a field and hold some data in that field. So what an architect will do is they'll say, well, okay, what data needs to go in that field, and does this field need to, maybe it's a lookup to another object, and then they have to decide what kind of lookup it is. Is it a regular lookup field? Is it a master detail? And then take into all the different considerations of why you would use one versus the other, instead of just going and creating a field to make something work. You really have to think about all these different things around what you're doing. So sometimes these, it will already be laid out for you by someone that is an architect. They'll tell you, create this field as a master detail to this other object. But when you start to move into architecture, you start to think about those things yourself. Also things like account models. So person account versus account contact. That's another huge architectural decision that architects usually have to encounter, especially on a brand new implementation. Record ownership in the role hierarchy, that has an impact on who can see what data. Record access, will someone own too many records, which would create ownership skew. Things like large data volumes. When you start getting into the millions, 5 million plus records, then you might start to deal with large data volume issues, which is scalability. Should the data be housed on Salesforce, or should it be archived to an external system? So those are some things that you can think about if you're in a large data volume org or orgs. You can have multi-org as well, which is a whole nother part of architecture. Integrations with external systems is a large part of it. So when you're creating your integrations, there might be a lot of point-to-point integrations in some implementations versus using middleware. So sometimes you might recommend bringing in middleware over creating a call out to another system. So an example of that might be in your Apex code, you would just call out an endpoint, and that's a point-to-point integration instead of going through the middleware. So an example of using middleware might be like creating a platform event and sending that to MuleSoft. And then MuleSoft takes care of sending that data to the external systems. And then that way MuleSoft can send it to multiple systems instead of just sending it to one. So it's more scalable when you bring in middleware. Real-time callouts from Lightning components. This is another popular one. An example would be maybe you have to do some verification for somebody that's signing up, going through a sign-up process. So they put in some data and you have to make a call out to an external system, and you're not allowing them to move through in the process until that data is validated, and you need to get a response from that external system. So that's another type of integration that's a lot of times thought about in architecture. What's the best way to do that? Are you going to run into your long running call out limit? So then maybe you use a continuation in your Apex, or external services is another way these are done nowadays, from calling out from flow. So then is a response required? So does an update need to happen from the external system? So can you just create a fire and forget integration and just send the data off, or do you have to wait for that response? And the example would be such as validating some data before you let someone move through a process. And then, you take into considerations how many API calls will be made. Another thing that is very common in architecture is determining the licenses that need to be used. So, are they the correct licenses for users to access objects and do their day-to-day jobs? So something else that you can do in your day-to-day job is create diagrams. Architects love to draw diagrams. I love drawing them. I love drawing them by hand. I do them in lucid charts. Get familiar with diagrams and creating diagrams and using them to show the work that you're doing. So it can be very simple. You could just be showing the data model for some new objects that need to be created for a process. Or maybe there's a new integration coming into the picture. How will this integration work? What are all the pieces? Will it be real time, asynchronous? What kind of authentication will be used? You can easily draw this out. I recently was preparing for the CTA review board, and I really had to understand payment processing with payment gateways and also DocuSign. And I just read through documentation, and I just went into Lucidchart and just started creating some lines and boxes and showing what data was going in each direction, so I could understand all the pieces in the communication between the different systems and the security mechanisms. So, where I wanted to draw out where the OAuth flow was happening and when was the response coming back from DocuSign, what was Salesforce doing, and then when does Salesforce interact with DocuSign again? So you draw the lines showing the data and the security interactions back and forth between the systems. It can be as simple as that. So I gave some, some examples here, like Facebook social sign-on. Oh, I'm connecting to Salesforce with, OpenID. Here I have an outbound message going to an external system, or, using a pub sub, publish and subscribe integration, using a platform event to an ERP. So maybe you have some existing integrations and you want to really understand them. You can ask questions, and you can read documentation, and you can draw these diagrams to help yourself get familiar with the architectural diagrams. Here's another example. This is for an ERD. If you want to just create an ERD, this is a little more complex, or something that it was actually from a CTA scenario, but this is an example of what you can do and how you can label your ERDs. You can have your external lookups and master details annotated, and just you can put your LDV and say whether it's private OWD or public OWD. So things like that you can practice doing. Another thing architects do is they follow best practices. They also recommend best practices for everyone else to follow. So architects are familiar with all the best practices. Can you identify areas of improvement where you can maybe bring in best practices to your everyday job? So some examples are coding practices. Are they being followed? You can implement code analysis tools such as PMD, ESLint, CodeScan, things like that. That will help bring in a lot of standardization to your coding. And you can create the rules that you can help create the rules that these code analysis tools will use. So that would all be based on a lot of the Salesforce best practices, but also what you come up with as well as a company. Is there a mature DevOps process? And so many times I get into projects and I don't see a mature DevOps process, and it just makes things so much harder for the developers and for the admins and everyone involved, and for release management. So maybe you can recommend bringing in some DevOps automation, or suggest using tools. If you're not on GitHub or Bitbucket, bring that in and start using it. And then you can move to source-driven development, which is another really popular thing. That source-driven development is a really big thing with architecture these days, and CI/CD, the continuous implementation, continuous development, continuous integration, continuous development, SFDX, Capado. Those are some examples of tools that you can bring in for DevOps. Another thing is data quality being maintained? Are you using validation rules? Are you using duplicate rules? How clean is your data? This is such an important thing, and especially when you're bringing data in from other systems and you're doing integrations, or you're sending data out of Salesforce, you really want your data to be quality. You don't want to have a lot of duplicates. You don't want to have a lot of mistakes. You want things to be pretty standard, especially if you need to match records between systems, and sometimes there's fuzzy matching that's being done. You really need your data to be clean and to be reliable. And then, are you relying on automation tools when necessary? So this is the whole clicks versus code thing. So you don't want to over customize. You don't want to over code. You don't want too much Apex. I see nowadays a lot of companies are moving from triggers to flow, now that we have flows that will trigger upon record updates. So you can actually do a lot of the same things in flow that you could do in triggers. Another big part of architecture is governance. This is DevOps is part of this a bit, but there's more about process when it comes to governance. So it's more about the different stakeholders, have a defined release management process and assign someone to oversee it. But in companies where they didn't have that, and it was a nightmare. Define a daily developer workflow. You make sure your developers are, getting the latest changes every morning before they start to work on their branch of code, so that they're not, checking in a bunch of code that's, many check-ins out of date, and then, doing a daily commit, and then creating pull requests early, even before they're done doing their code. That's actually something I've read recently that's highly recommended, is doing an early pull request. That way, if someone starts reviewing the code early on, and they can actually identify issues before the last minute, and then you can keep working on your code while that pull request is open. Set up a center of excellence. A lot of companies don't have one. It can be very small. It can just be a couple people. Just bring in some stakeholders, some people from business, people from IT that are working together to make sure the business is meeting its expectations and achieving the key goals. Set up an architecture review board. That's a great one. So before any changes are going to be brought into an agile process, such as a sprint, the architecture review board can take a look at it and say, is this really important for us to be working on right now? Is this going to meet our priorities that we've set for? Maybe they're doing PI planning or something. So architecture review boards can help review change requests before they get into the backlog, and determine if the priority meets their threshold. Follow methodologies such as agile or hybrid, such as Agile Scrum Fall. So that's bringing in both waterfall and agile. You might ask when you want to do that. Well, a lot of times the integration work streams need to follow more of a waterfall methodology, whereas the developers can follow more of an agile methodology. So you sometimes bring those together where you're doing both development and integration, and the development relies on the integration. So because integration is a bit more, there's a bit more risk there. So when there's higher risk, you want to use something more like waterfall, so that you can really identify stuff up front and have a defined process that you're going to follow. And then also define a testing strategy. I see testing as something that is not used quite a bit out there in project work and implementation work. And you have your Salesforce test classes, but there's also other testing tools that you can bring in. You could be doing testing in QA and UAT, and you can actually use things like Load Runner or Selenium to actually do some load testing, or mimic users and what they're doing with the UI, like things they're clicking on. So you can actually automate some of that, so you're not relying just on your QA resources. Especially if you don't have a lot of QA resources, it's better to bring in those testing tools earlier in the process. And then identify your use of environments. Make sure the right environments are being used. This is a diagram, popular one from Salesforce, that shows your development environments, your tests, your UAT stage, your production, and then also how they interact with GitHub, and where the GitHub commits and pull requests will push code to. So those are the pipelines that would be, you'd have probably a CI/CD tool in between GitHub and the environments that's pushing the code to different environments when pull requests happen. So you can look at your environments and say, okay, what are we using? Do we have a full sandbox? Are we using it for UAT staging? Where's our testing sandbox? What kind of sandbox is it? What are we using for development? And if you're on SFBX, you're probably using Scratch orgs. And then understand your org security. When changes need to be made, you'll be better prepared. You'll understand it more. When things like record locking happen, you can contribute to solving the problems. So you might want to look at things such as the role hierarchy, number of roles. There's a maximum 500,000 with approval from Salesforce. And this can have a huge impact on sharing recalculation, causing performance issues and record locks. Maybe look at your sharing rules. There's also a maximum number of sharing rules. There's 50 criteria-based sharing rules per object, 500 total. So too many sharing rules can slow down inserts and updates and cause issues. Org-wide defaults, are they providing enough security? Is everything wide open? Is everything public? Maybe there needs to be some private or by defaults on some objects where only certain people are supposed to see certain data. Maybe not everything's supposed to be open for everyone. And then your profiles and permission sets. Something else people are moving away from these days in implementations is profiles. Are there too many profiles? Should some permissions be migrated to permission sets? And now we have permission set groups as well to make assigning permission sets much easier when creating new users. And then understand the capabilities of the different clouds. There may be features in another Salesforce cloud that's available to solve problems. So learn about the capabilities of each of the clouds and even the Salesforce add-ons. How you might be able to incorporate them, Sales Cloud features, use of leads, lead assignment, flipped lead. That's something that people aren't really aware of is you can do omni-channel in Sales Cloud. So you can have leads come in and get assigned through omni-channel skills-based routing and omni-channel. So that's the Sales Cloud plus digital engagement license. Service Cloud features, and that's also digital engagement, which includes things like the messaging, where you can have your service agents messaging people over SMS or via Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp. And the omni-channel skills-based routing and things like CTI and the Service Cloud console. You can also have a console in Sales Cloud as well. And then Community Cloud, when you might want to use Community Cloud and have external sharing and an external sharing model. Do you have partners and you have customers that maybe could benefit from setting up a community? And then Marketing Cloud is another big one that provides a lot of capabilities. So email marketing, customer journeys, and then you have Pardot as well for more B2B type of marketing and lead scoring and capabilities like that. Also, you can engage with stakeholders. So maybe start to understand who your stakeholders are, communicate some of your ideas. There's project management, project sponsors, product owners. Start getting to know who these people are, because that's really an important part of becoming an architect, is being able to engage with them and have discussions and put out your ideas and get someone behind something that you feel strongly about. You can help fill in any missing gaps where there may be any in the requirements. And this would be with your stakeholders, your business stakeholders. You can help to communicate project objectives and initiatives. And if you want to recommend something, be ready to defend and justify your selections. And that is another huge part of architecture, is when you put something out there, you can't just throw it out there. You have to be able to say why you want to do it and give the reasons for it, and also justify against other options. And then just be curious, what's really going on behind the scenes. Ask questions about the technical aspects of how a solution is implemented. You can never ask too many questions when you're learning architecture. What security mechanism is this using, and something like that, or maybe go set up something in a sandbox or a developer org. Poke around in your own org and identify areas of improvement. Play around in the sandbox doing R&D. I wouldn't recommend that in your company orgs, but set up your own trailhead, or just set up a developer org and maybe set up some stuff up like how to share data with internal, external users. That's one of my favorite things I worked on while sitting for the review board. Community sharing and sharing sets, and how to allow customers to see data and share files with them. Can customers be added to case teams, or can they see the case? That was another thing I played around with a lot. How can you display data securely from an external object to an external user? So you can really play around and do a lot of R&D on a lot of these different things. And that's what everyone I know that's going through the review board, they do the same thing. We're just constantly playing around and setting things up to really understand, because to really understand, you have to do it. It's not just reading about something or studying, it's actually doing something, and then it really will help make sense. And finally, I have a bunch of architect resources. So for CTA, I run a study group, and it's kind of a study community now. It's mostly on Slack, but we meet 4 days a week. If you want to be added to that, just contact me. I'll go over my information again. I did take the review board in November. It didn't pass. I'm planning to do a retake again soon. So I'm constantly active in the study community and still studying and learning myself. Also, there's Ladies Be Architects. That's another huge resource that people find very helpful. There's the Salesforce Architect community, and there's also a bunch of architect blogs. So these are some of my favorites, some of my friends that I will definitely give a shout out to here, and I highly recommend. There's my Twitter handle. So you can contact me on Twitter. That's my Trailblazer ID, and that is it.